Good morning everyone, welcome to the class. Thailand is a land full of archaeological sites and objects which are evidence of the continuous evolution of the Thai history and culture dating back several thousand years. Many prehistorical sites are frequently discovered in Thailand. Besides, the way of life of Thai people reveals fine cultural heritage and rich arts in itself. Thailand is greatly appreciated by tourists for having beautiful Buddhist temples, so much that it has been known as the Kingdom of the Yellow Robe. Also, its royal palaces are complimented for the unsurpassed beauty of architectural expression. They all have won the admiration of the tourists from all over the globe. Both temples and palaces are the places of collection of a multitude of objects of arts, including painting and sculptures. They have their own unique characters and differed greatly from those of their neighbors in Asia. Shadow play, the nut. Origin of the shadow play. The earliest shadow play in the East existed in all probability in India. To quote from the authority of Nicholas, Pichel established that the shadow play existed in India from a very remote place. In the Buddhist text of the Therigatha, which belonged to the Pali Canon, we have the young nun Shubha, who spurned the love of a young man too engrossed with worldly realities. As he described to her the splendor of this world, the Virgin replied, "Blind man, thou enthuse over a thing which is unreal, as a shadow which you see, as a tree of gold seen in a dream, as a shadow figure exhibited to a crowd of people." Moreover, several allusions are made in the Mahabharata to the action of kings, ministers, etc., exhibited by means of figures to hide on a screen of thin cloth. And lastly, he mentioned theatrical plays called the Chaya Nataka, which he translated as Saturn, Shakespeare, shadow play. It should be added here that marionettes projected on screens were also common in ancient India. Nicholas goes on to raise a question. It is very probable that the Siamese shadow play had its origin in India as most of the other kinds of spectacles, but was it directly descended therefrom? The problem is still difficult to solve, although one generally agrees in believing that it was through the intermediary of Java that Siam received from India her shadow play. Nicholas wrote the above in 1927. Further research has since been taking place. It is now, in my opinion, proved without doubt that the Thai Narch came up from the empire of Sri Vijaya through the Malaya Peninsula to our valley of the Menam Chopia and had in the process undergone distinctive developments which have demonstrated the Thai spirit of originality and adoption. Direction of its immigration. Let us now make a sketch of the direction of immigration of the Nai up to Thailand. As with the story of Ram, with which the shadow play is intimately associated, the shadow play crossed the ocean from the eastern coast of South India to the empire of Sri Vijaya in Sumatra, where it went on to Java. There, besides the story of Ram, according to the version of Valmiki's Ramayana, the story was already interpolated with extra episodes. Some of these no doubt crossed over the ocean with the main theme, while others were of indigenous origin, for the story of Ram became identified with local tradition in due time. In Java too, the epic of the Mahabharata became an equally esteemed source of inspiration. Later on, native romances were also screened. The shadow play, however, which came up the Malay Peninsula, seemed to have retained only the story of Ram, thereby having a semblance of coming up direct from Sumatra, where it is tempting to believe that they were still restricted to the original theme of the Ramayana. We do not know exactly when the shadow play reached the valley of the Menam Chao of the Thai. The earliest authentic mention is to be found in the Palatine law of King Boro Matrailokanath, enacted in 1458. There is of course a mention of the Nan in the Romance of the Lady Nopfant's prose work depicting the course life of the Sukhothai regime of Nicholas. While giving some value to this source of history, had to admit that its chronological standing was unpure plus sujat a caution. The word Nan. In Thai, the shadow play is called Nan, which may be translated as hide figures. The name has obviously been derived from the material from which the figures are made. When developments of it sprang up, the Nar became known as Nar Yai, the play with big figures. When dancing became its accompaniment, it was called Nandram or Nan Rabam. An innovation with smaller figures was introduced from the south, was known as the Nan Tailing. The later word being an abbreviated form of the name of the province of Patalum. The latest Nan is the modern cinema, so called because it too had to be screened. In this paper, Nan is used for the Nar Yans. It usually is in common parlance. To judge by the number of figures known to exist in the country and abroad in private collections, there must have been a wide popularity for this kind of entertainment in days past. At the Leder Museum, for instance, at Offenbach near Frankfurt, there were in 1963 over 200 of these figures collected without knowledge of the subject, though well cared for. The collection is described with detailed illustration in the Journal of the Siam Society. Accessories. The main accessory of the Nan is naturally the collection of hide figures. The whole process in the manufacture of the figure is described at great length in the anonymous Thai article. Cow hide is first immersed in water till tender, then exposed to the sun to dry. It is then smoothened by an iron instrument. Soot is applied to both surfaces and the skin is left to dry in the sun. When dried, it is rubbed over with a gauze so that it is polished by the gauze smooth surface. The hide is now ready for the artist to draw figures on. The parts between the lines are then cut out. In the case of colored figures for the day performances, the sooted surface is first rubbed and then repainted in colors. Light colorless surface is obtained by just scratching out the soot from the hide. For other colors, the following mixtures of natural colors are employed. For green, a mixture of lime and copper sulphate. For red, sandal and alum. For yellow, sandal rubbed over with lime, and so on. A pole is now haveled and a figure is framed between them. As far as the design, figures are made alone as well as in couples, the latter usually fixed in a fighting pose. Groups too are made, very often backgrounds of celestial or human sceneries such as mansions, forests, mountains, seas, etc. Superstition ordains many formalities in the process. The figures, for instance, of the gods of Hinduism, such as Vishnu and Shiva and the Rishi, must be made of the hide of a virgin cow. For the Rishi, however, the hide of a tiger or a bear is sometimes preferred. Next to be figures comes the screen. This is made of a thin piece of white cloth in the middle with double pieces at either side, so that the effect would be to show up the center in the screening. The screen is duly decorated on either side with colored cloth and held down to its position by ropes. It is mentioned in the Thai article that an innovation in the decoration of the screen had been lately introduced at the time of writing of apertures at either side, over which were painted the walls of the city of Lorca on one side and the camp of Ram on the other, while above are painted the goddess Mekhala, tantalizing the demon Ramasun with the jewel of the lighting. This innovation was known as the chokhui or apertured screen. Technique of the representation. When all is ready with the screen, the figures are brought out and laid down in what may be called sets, the object of which seems to have been that the figures would be conveniently at hand for the successive requirement of them. Musicians and manipulators would assemble before dusk, which is as a rule the time for commencement. When the time arrives, the sponsor of the entertainment would hand to the chief representative of the performing troupe 3 candles and a ceremonial fee. At the time of the writing of that article, this fee was 2.5 quarters of a bath. The leader of the troupe then hands one of the 3 candles to the chief the orchestra, who lights and fixes it to his spoon, a drum-like instrument with which he sets the pace of the music and generally keeps time for the whole orchestra. The spoon, in fact, does the duty of the baton in a Western orchestra. The latter then commences a salutation to the impersonal master of music, consisting of 6 fixed airs. This done, the other 2 candles are lighted by manipulators in honor respectively of Vishnu and Shiva, and again the offering of candles is accompanied by stipulated tunes reserved for those 2 Hindu gods. Invocations are now made by way of propitiation of the master of the Nar by reciters. They are worded in archaisms and very difficult to understand. The oldest form of these invocation is known as the Paksamatra. This is divided into 3 thue, which may be rendered as canton. The first canto commences with a salutation to King Dashrath and the hero Ram. It then goes on to a quaint, cusy, harmonious passage describing the process of carving out a Nar figure from cow hide. The second canto salutes first the Rishi or Shir, from whom is our success. Then the Buddha's virtues are invoked. Then Anirudh, the initiator, and the Gemini of the forest, the streams and the mountains, and lastly the old master, presumably of the Nar. At the end of these salutations, the canto goes on to announce the story of the Ramakien would now be exhibited on the screen. The third canto dwells on the spirit in which the Naj is staged on rival screens. The passage may perhaps be thus rendered to give an idea of the canto. It is now the turn of the master of the torch to set fire to the fagots. As the flames spring up, the orchestra strikes up a march. The manipulators and the reciters at once commence their respective roles. It is pointed out in the same article that an exhibition in the palace omits some of these formalities and starts at once with the exhibition called Ushering in the Early Evening Monkeys, a duel between the white and the black monkeys. Then the performance commences. Each height figure is held up by its two poles on either hand of the manipulator, the latter in panning fastened by a belt with a jacket and a head scarf. As he manipulates the figure, he is automatically bound to bend and sway, at the same time keeping time with his foot movements. In between the recitations, there may be pauses for an action without words, such as a march, when the orchestra would strike up appropriate music and the manipulator would more or less adopt certain steps in consonance with it. He in fact practically dances, the height figure often doing the mere duty of identifying his role. It was in every likelihood this fact which gave incement in due time to the manipulator to discard the height figure and thereby transform the performance onto what became later a khanas, suggested at the end of this monograph. Stories for the play. According to Thai, a favorite theme of old times was the campaigns of Tut, Khorn and Tristan. Two of these names would be recognized by those familiar with the Ramayana of Valmiki if they were written Dashanand Khara. The third, Trisan, is an additional role possibly invented in this country. They were relatives of the demon princess Samanakha, came out to avenge the rebuff which she suffered from Ram and his brother when she unsuccessfully made love to them and molested Ram's wife Sita. It is said that the exhibition started at dusk, usually reached the fall of Khorn at midnight, when it was a signal to put an end to the screening. Hence the phrase Lam Khorn, the fall of Khorn, came to be used in popular parlance for the conclusion of anything. Such episodes as the weapon of Brahma and Mairapet magician became more popular later. Looking up records, it is found that the Samudagos, a poem written in first part by the jury's consult of King Narai, mentioned another story as having formed a story for the Narj, which should be here quoted. His Majesty Ramadhipati of formidable might, recollecting the story of the great teacher, having been Prince Samudagos, who, reincarnating from a heavenly life in celestial worlds, was born on earth and became skilled in the art of the bow, winning victory in a rival contest among heroic royal warriors, and thereby won the hand of the beautiful Bindumati. His Majesty therefore gave orders that a poem on the subject be composed and beautiful figures cut out of hide to depict this romance on the screen. The romance of Panji, the hero of Javanese history, became popular in the reign of Ayodhya. One or perhaps two versions in Thai dramatic verse is said to have been written, which has unfortunately disappeared. Those were days prior to printing. There might have existed only one or at best a few manuscript copy or copies, which probably suffered in the general sack in 1767 of Ayodhya. A version of this romance, believed to have been composed in the reign of Rama I of the Chakri dynasty, was probably the source of inspiration to the well-known Iano of King Rama II. In this later work, there is an episode in which height figures were made to screen the story of Panji. In modern days, neither the Samudagos nor the Panji romance is ever screened. Not a single height figure of either exists except the cardboard ones of the Iano romance made by order of his late Majesty King Prajadipok, now preserved in the museum. It was the king's intention to screen them, but it never materialized. Not being made of hide, they will not last. They remain at any rate to testify to the monarch's wealthy aim to resecute an art which was and still is threatening to die a natural death. The Narj Ram. The Narj Ram, often called Nar Rabam, used according to our Thai authority, above quoted, to be performed in daytime with colored figures. The manipulators might have been more ornately dressed as befitting a daylight performance in the open. They appeared on the stage to the accompaniment of song and music, depicting a celestial dance of the well-known episode of the spring season, in which the goddess Mekhala tantalized the demon Ramasan with her jewel of a lighting. A beautiful specimen of a figure Mekhala painted in blue exists in the National Museum and is herewith reproduced. The Nar Ram, being usually performed in the late afternoon up to dusk, retained the screen but was not accompanied by a fire. It performed a prelude to the Narjye. This variety of the Nar, mentioned by the Thai article as a recent development, might have been in its idea much older than it was understood to be, for the author, in saying recent, seemed to have been more concerned with the screen and its decoration, and was perhaps not referring at all to its idea. In any case, since we see now without much doubt that the shadow play was the masked play's predecessor, the Nar Ram should supply us with a very important missing link in the development of the Na 77 into the Khon. It would be in fact identical with the Khon before the screen, sketched out in the lecture of the Siam Society in 1947, which should be quoted here. The first variety, the Khon before a screen, was of course the immediate stage of transition from the shadow play, retaining as it does the screen of the Nar. Although this fact has not been generally accepted, it seems to me obviously so for the following reasons. The presence of the screen is an indication of the transition. The sidelong movements of the masked players is also an indication of a former attempt to represent the hide figures by means of human beings, who thus try to show their profile rather than their full faces. The book of the Khon before the screen was just the identical camphak of the shadow play in use before the composition of the Redmakin of 1798 by King Ram I. This speculation has now been confirmed by the analogy of Java, which is now come across. According to an authority on the Javanese dance, R.M. Sirupino in Javanese Classical Dances, London Geographical Magazine, September 1946. The dance dramas are derived from plays with puppets selective from the screen, called Vayang Purva or Vayang Kulit. Vayang means shadows, and the fact that the play with human beings is called Vayang, namely Vayang Vong, indicates clearly that the play with silhouettes is the original form. This is further shown not only by the mask-like lack of expression in the dancers' faces, but also by their poses, since they always try to imitate the carved leather puppets of the shadow play and to move in two-dimensional directions. This Javanese analogy fits into the letter with what I have been trying to prove. The mask play before the screen was performed in old days without any other stage accessories than is used in the shadow play. Its book was identical, that is to say the camp fact. The action is quicker and more virile than the later types, which are partly based on the elaborate dance drama. It only remains to be summed up that the Thai nar, derived from a very old Indian source, has rendered its service due to humanity both on its own merit and also through its development in the form of the corn. In itself, it does not look like being able to withstand the test of the time, but its development, the corn, has every chance of survival to testify to the independence of Thai art if sufficient and proper encouragement is forthcoming through the School of Choreography of the Royal Fine Arts Department of the government.